In round 3 of the Tata Steel tournament, Daniil Dubov faced off against Vidit Gujrathi in an epic game which many are calling the best game of 2022 so far. And it really was a stunning game, back and forth, who knew what was going on. So we had this Italian game on the board, and now we had knight f6, pawn to d3, bishop c5, pawn to c3 and bishop to d6. So very standard opening moves in the Italian, and now white can go with this knight to d2 or castles, many different moves here, but Dubov goes bishop to g5. Quite a provocative move because you pin this knight to the queen, this pawn's come outside the pawn chain, and you provoke black into playing h6, and after the bishop comes back, sometimes black goes g5 here. If you do this immediately, you don't sack the knight like this is no good. But the bishop drops back, and it's double-edged because these pawns could become attacking later. The king hasn't yet committed, but you've also weakened that side of the board where your king is currently sat, or sat very near. So after the bishop came back to h4, now we had pawn to a5 from Vidit. He doesn't play pawn to g5. So he gets on with this standard expansion on the queen side here, gives the bishop some room, and now Dubov plays a really interesting idea. He plays knight to a3. Once again, knight to d2 or castles is more common. And it's interesting as well that he played as Magnus's second during the World Championship match recently. And we saw that amazing Magnus game against Giri where he put the knight on a3. That was a Catalan, of course, and I'll link that on screen now if you want to check it out after this video. But anyway, he puts the knight on the edge of the board, allowing black to double the pawns here, and Vidit takes up the gauntlet, doubling those pawns, going in for the fight. But in compensation, he does have the bishop pair now, and he does have an open b-file. So queen to e7 now from Vidit. He doesn't want to castle too soon. He lends protection to e5, and we'll see that he's looking to re-maneuver his knight now. So after white castles, he plays knight to b8. It might look quite weird, but he's looking to play in this manner that's very similar to the Breyer variation, redeploying this knight to lend some support here and take away the danger of this pin. Now we had d4, very standard to break in the centre after the knight has left this square. Now knight b to d7, carrying on that plan. And here white could go rook to e1, just defending that pawn. And it's a really nice position for white here, as we can see. The king's still stuck in the centre, black is lacking space, so an opening success. Instead, Dubov goes for rook to b1 here, hitting that open file, but it does allow Vidit to now play like this. So pawn to g5, kicking that bishop, and now knight takes on e4. A really daring way to play. Daring or foolish, who knows? Because by taking this pawn, you're ripping open lines towards your own king now, which is still in the centre, which you don't normally want to do. Now you can't go rook e1 immediately, or this pawn drops with the fork here. So queen c2 holds that pawn, hits the knight. And now best here for black, according to the engines, is knight takes on g3, and after pawn recaptures, you play this position. But it looks really scary to open the f-file like this in combination with the bishop. I can see why Vidit didn't do this. So instead he plays pawn to f5. But this looks equally scary, pushing more pawns in front of your king. You're not yet properly developed. So Dubov now takes on e5, which is really logical. Let's start ripping open lines. The pawn recaptured, and now he brings the rook across to the e-file. And here it's really tough for black. You can't start developing this knight anywhere to free up the bishop, because otherwise the e5 pawn drops. We can see it's attacked twice by these pieces. So that's why we had chops here. Now the pawn recaptured. There's pressure here, so black has to kick on. It looks horrible to push like this, but you have to try and hold the centre together. And now there isn't actually a threat to take here, because otherwise you lose the queen. So Dubov takes the chance to play pawn to g4. Great move. Undermining this chain, once again ripping open the lines. Knight c5 is a good response, opening the eyes of the bishop to recapture here. And now Dubov doesn't take immediately, because after bishop recaptures, knight to d4, bishop to g6, this is just a bit slow. You've let black develop with this tempo. So instead of doing this, Dubov plays knight to d4 immediately. Good move. And now we had rook to f8, overprotecting this pawn. Now the pawn was captured, the bishop took, and this is where Dubov plays an absolute thunderbolt of a move, just ripping open the black position. Pause if you want to find it, and if you're enjoying this video, then do subscribe to the channel to never miss one of my daily videos. So we had rook takes on b7, fantastic move, and this rook is actually immune. So if you take it back, which didn't happen, then we get bishop to b5 check, really nice follow-up. Now what's going on here? Well, if the bishop blocks, which would be a bad move, then you can take on e4 and you're skewering the queen to the king. If the king steps to d8, then you come in here and you have this knight fork. So you'd have to play king to f7, and now you simply pick up this bishop and the whole house is collapsing for black. There's weaknesses everywhere, as we can see. The pieces are really discoordinated, not good. So Vidit saw this and didn't go in for it. After the rook captured here, he didn't take it. Instead, he played basically the only move to stay alive in the position. Fantastic calculation, rook to f6. It covers some key squares on the 6th rank here. This checking square, for example, which we noted in some of those variations. And also it gives the king some room here in this direction. So now we had queen to b1. Now you could have retreated that exchange back to b5, the computers like to pressure here, but okay, it's a complex position, and after the rook is captured, which Vidit did do now, the queen recaptures, and we can see the danger of this manoeuvre from Daniil Dubov. Even though he's an exchange down, look at the pressure he now has. The rook came to d8 as we see, and now Dubov has to figure out how to intensify the pressure. This e4 pawn is key, it's blocking out the rook. The bishop protects it. So that's why Dubov simply chops here, the rook recaptures, and now he takes in the centre. And visually, when you look at this, you're thinking black must be completely collapsing here. I mean, look at the sorry state of the king and queen and this powerful light squared bishop. But there is an exceptional way to stay in the game here. So if you go rook e5 to block, that's a mistake, because then you have queen c6 check. And after king f8, you can take on h6 with check, and the whole thing's collapsing basically. If you come back to e8, then you can check here and you're picking up the rook. If you block with the queen, well, you can take, then pick up the rook. All sorts of problems. And after the check here, if you block with the rook like this, well then again there's a check on g6. Lots of different checks to run the black king around. Check on g8, and after you block with the queen, you're picking up the rook here due to the pins, and this queen is protected by the bishop, as we can see. White's a piece ahead. So lots of tricky variations going on here, but the point being, you can't interpose the rook in this position unless you go rook to d1 check first, which is what Vidit did. Beautiful move. You kick the king here, and now you interpose the rook. And the key difference is that after the check, you've vacated the d8 square for the king. So the king slides across now. Queen a8 check, king d7. Vidit's just tiptoeing on this tightrope right now. And after bishop b5 check, again he plays the only move, king e6. If you play here, now you're actually running into mate in one with queen c6 mate. So he plays king e6, now we had queen c8 check, king f6, another good move, queen h8 check, king f5, really nicely calculated, and now you're actually hitting the rook as well. So Dubov has to reflect now, how do I proceed in this position? And he had to actually play queen c8 check. And amazingly, the king can't take the rook here, or now you have queen g4 check, king d5 only move, queen c4, king d6, and you have this same checkmate. It's crazy how you just run the king around the board like that. Really insane stuff. So coming back here, the king wouldn't have been able to take the rook in this position after the check. You would have had to play king g6 or king f6, and we would have had some kind of repetition. But Dubov was pushing for more, understandably. So if we come back to king f5 here, he played pawn to f3, defending this rook, pushing for more with his queen and bishop, trying to mate black. But he miscalculated, because now Vidit can go takes here, the pawn recaptured with check, the king took back, and now Dubov does get some checks, but amazingly the king is just coming down the board into the heart of the white position, and now white's in trouble here because black's an exchange up and his own king is coming under fire. So now Dubov goes bishop to c6, a retreating move, defending down towards this pawn. We had queen e5 check, pawn to g3 blocks that, and now pawn to g4, an excellent move, shutting in the door on the king here, threatening moves like this. So we had queen a7 check, and king d2 was the final move of the game. It's completely gone now because the king is finding safety on c1, and there are even lines where you can just go into endgames here. Say white checks on f2, you can even just block like this, or you can play king d2. The whole thing's over for white. If you enjoyed this video, then do click here to see Carlsen playing Giri with some similar ideas, and subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.